hydrogen accumulation in the presence of recursive plasma wakes.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I'm a NASA postdoc at Goddard Space Flight Center, and my talk has a pretty long and technical title, but it could be paraphrased as recursive plasma wakes make a volatile splash. And I'll say more about this, obviously, as we go on. But I want to say thanks to the forum for giving me the chance to tell you about what I've been working on. And thanks to the Dream Institute, Oak Ridge Associated Universities for funding my postdoc. And then also acknowledge my collaborators, Bill Farrell and Tim Stubbs at Goddard Space Flight Center. So I've been working for the last couple of years on studying the lunar polar plasma environment through computer simulations. And my research has direct relevance to a subset of the primary questions of the Dream Institute, which of course is dynamic response of the environment at the moon. In particular, I'm targeting these questions. What is the evolution of volatiles, including water ice, at the very cold lunar poles? Where and when is lunar surface charging the most intense? And how will we affect this fragile environment when we return to the moon? And how will this environment, the plasma environment, affect our exploration activities and our exploration infrastructure? So I want to mention that I've been focusing mostly on the latter two items, looking at surface charging, how plasma wakes form in polar craters, how surface charging feeds back on the wakes, how the wakes change in different plasma conditions, and then also looking at how astronauts might charge in various conditions, such as a passing solar storm. But today I'd like to talk about recent work we've been doing focusing on the first item, looking at how the plasma physics might couple into the concentration of volatiles at the poles. So it's well known to this community that there's now an abundance of data suggesting that there's water on the moon, on the surface, and just below the surface. However, to my knowledge, there's no clear connection between the properties of individual permanently shadowed regions at the poles and the inferred volatile concentrations from spacecraft data. And so we're wondering if there's actually a plasma physics component that is topographically modulating in detail the fluxes of ions to the surface, which then feeds into the accumulation or sputtering of volatiles. And so I want to back up and talk about a little bit of the plasma physics of the wakes in polar craters, and then move on to some simulation data showing that we can actually model these things and talk about how that might couple into the volatile concentrations that are observed. So you can see here in the top panel, of course, the moon is like a rock in a stream. The solar wind flows out from the sun and hits the moon, creating this plasma wake that extends many lunar radii downstream. And by direct analogy, you can imagine if you're standing at the poles of the moon, the solar wind is moving horizontally past the surface, and if there is an obstruction like a rock or an outcropping or a topographic depression like a crater, the same sort of thing will happen. It's obstructing the flow of solar wind, and so we'll get a miniature wake downstream of these obstructions at the poles. And so I've schematically represented that in sort of a cartoon form in the bottom slide. And the thing to really take away from this is that we originally had solar wind flowing horizontally past the surface, but due to the wake physics, formation of the wake, it forms an electric field, and that diverts protons toward the surface of the crater, where they may implant or sputter volatile products from the surface. So this is sort of a candidate plasma physics process that we're thinking about might have a leading role in governing the concentrations of volatiles at the poles. And so here, just to even back up even farther and just talk for a minute about what's happening in the formation of each wake, you can imagine upstream, the solar wind flow has been obstructed in the lower half of this plot. And we have the solar wind moving past us from left to right. Heavy protons and light electrons make up the solar wind predominantly. And the electrons are fast and light, and so they'll zip right into the crater, right into that, across that plasma vacuum boundary. And this, of course, sets up a charge separation, which gives rise to an ambipolar electric field. And then over a much longer time scale, the ions, which are quite heavy, will be drawn into the crater under the influence of this field. And here I've drawn in my obstruction upstream. This whole thing is evolving over time as the plasma is convecting downstream. This creates a stationary wake in the frame of the moon. And so we've been running particle and cell simulations at Goddard to model how this actually happens in the presence of somewhat idealized topography, with the ultimate goal of generalizing to real lunar topography and even looking at how these protons, which strike the surface downstream, might couple into the volatile story. Okay, so here's actual simulation data. I've just developed this code at Goddard. It's a particle and cell plasma code where we actually track electrons and protons from the solar wind. And what you'll see here, just like in the previous slide, we have ions which are blue and electrons which are red. And the electrons will zip into the crater, create an ambipolar field in the bottom plot, and then the protons will follow much later. And there we go. Okay, so we have the basic wake structure, but now you notice we've actually included sputtering in this code. So what we're doing is we have a relatively icy surface just for this model, and the protons are being diverted into the crater and striking the surface and liberating water from the surface via sputtering. And this whole process is, the water coming up is ballistic and collisionless, so it's not interacting, it doesn't undergo close encounters with plasma particles. But one neat thing here, you can see we're scouring water from the surface downstream, and it's traveling back upstream where it coats the crater wall. So of course something like this a model like this would need to be integrated over an entire lunation for the different plasma conditions that are encountered to get the full picture of what's going on. For the moment, we're neglecting that. So here I have, so basically we'd really love to take this kind of a model and run it for the entire pole, right? So this is a 2D model that I just showed you. To go to 3D for these kinds of scales to incorporate a very large swath of the pole is computationally unfeasible, even in 2D. So what we're trying to do is to look at different idealized topography configurations like multiple steps, multiple step-like craters, to actually combine that with theory, the theory of plasma wakes, and then generalize these results to real topography to figure out what the proton flux is to basically get a proton fluence in high detail at the poles of the moon. So here I have simulation data. We've modeled the proton flux. This is the vertical proton flux for a wake downstream of a single step. And then I can actually take out the proton flux along the surface, which is what you see at the very bottom. That's how many, you can see that more and more protons strike the surface as we go farther and farther downstream. The really nice thing about the theory, so I've included a couple of equations here. If we're going to try to understand this with theory, what really matters is that we know what the solar wind conditions are. That's the first ratio in this top right box. And then the other important thing, we need to know where we're at with respect to the occultation point, which is P0 in this plot. So if we know those two things, we can predict really well what the proton flux is to the surface within this kind of a configuration. So can we generalize this by looking at multiple steps and maybe going down to very small steps to get inclined surfaces and whatnot? That's what we're working on. So here we have a double step crater with a very small secondary step. And I have two lines. I've brought out the surface proton flux in this plot on the bottom. And we have two predictions. The one that works really well is if we just assume that we have one occultation point far upstream at the top, at the first crater, at the parent crater. And the reason that this particular prediction works really well is because the secondary step isn't really cutting into the proton flow that's been diverted from the solar wind. So in this kind of a configuration, we don't need to worry about the recursive aspect of the wake, a wake within a wake. But if we go to a different configuration where we have a much longer secondary step and it's actually really cutting into the diverted proton flow, now we need to consider components we need to consider the upstream wake as well as the downstream wake embedded within that. And so we've actually been working towards extending the theory, the 2D theory, to incorporate these kinds of effects. And so again, the best thing that works here is to actually use a recursive mathematical function incorporating both the upstream and the downstream structure. So again, we hope to keep working on this and generalize this to real topography. And then just one other thing here, there's a lot of complication in various regimes. This is a 500-meter deep crater, much like the steps I showed you before, except we have an incline. On the bottom plot, that's the actual simulation with the incline. You can see the protons coming in and striking the surface. In the top panel, I have the same kind of a simulation, but only with a step, and I've sort of put the ghost of the incline there. That's not actually a surface, just to show you where it is from the second simulation. And you notice when we have an incline, the protons actually tend to curve in a little bit sooner than if we don't have the incline. And this is because we develop the surface charging develops an electric field, and that pulls in the ions more quickly. So this is also something we can try to add to the theory. And so in conclusion, perhaps the most important conclusion here is that solar wind ions do get into these polar craters via an ambipolar process, via wake formation. And we've developed this tool at Goddard to show that we can directly model the 2D ion inflow near complex kilometer scale topography. And with this new sputtering component, we can add a virtually limitless variety of sputtering products. And we hope that in the future, this product we're working to, that this simulation theory combo will be able to predict polar maps of water sputtering and proton implantation given various conditions. And I'll just leave you with the question, is there a unique topographically modulated plasma volatile connection that could explain the observed polar water concentrations? Thank you.
Nice work. Any questions?
What is the color scale on the bottom one?
Okay,
The red, yellow, and green there?
I believe it is, deep red is 1.5 volts per meter. It's on the order of 1. So.
Solar wind integrated over 1 billion years, what kind of depth of water are you talking about?
Yeah, it's unclear. A starting place would be just to integrate over a lunation, and then you could possibly multiply that, but I'm not sure. We really just plug in, I didn't say, we plugged in a water yield from Johnson 1989 and an energy energy distribution for emission from Sigmund 1969, but we can plug in anything we want and that makes sense and do these kinds of calculations.
Anybody else?